motivational system has cleared the decks for action, which is why when you are trying to avoid something, everything seems a little bit fearful. And when you're trying to achieve something great, everything seems fantastic. I mean, if you've ever met somebody like who's getting married in a week, you know, and they're like, life is just wonderful. It's, you know, everything is good. You're like, just calm down, right? But what's happening is they're in this state where there's this really desirable goal for them. They're about to get married. And so their focus is on every positive thing out there. Now, this also creates a bit of an interesting tension, because it means that we are overrepresenting the good stuff when we are focused on achieving a particular desirable goal. And we also overrepresent the bad stuff when we're trying to avoid something negative. So this is going to have an influence on people's likelihood of even wanting to engage in something and their likelihood of planning effectively, right? So you meet somebody getting married, right? The hardest thing to do with them is to say, have you considered a prenup? Right? You're like, what? And it's not just that they have a rosy picture of their particular relationship. It's that in that moment, in the face of this beautiful goal that they're trying to achieve, everything looks good. There couldn't possibly be a bad thing that's going to happen. Look, my potential mate is perfect, right? You know, later you see your partner with clearer eyes, and I don't mean this in a bad way, right? I just mean that everyone. I mean, I'm not a joy all the time, right? I admit that, and you see that more clearly after the goal that goal to get married subsides. But in the moment, you are not only focused on the particular goal, you have a generalized state of everything positive out there really looms large. And you see this in all kinds of places. If anybody ever bought a new car? Anybody? So if you ever notice when you're looking at a new car, you suddenly notice all the other people driving that same car on the road. Like you may never have noticed it before, and suddenly they're all over the place. Because you've engaged this goal, and now that information is everywhere. Right? The motivational system is tuning to the stuff in the world that might help you to achieve the goal. And by the way, this is generally a really good thing. My favorite story about this was, I used to live up on Far West, right off Far West, and there's that post office down the hill there. And I had a bill that was overdue, and so I had the bill on the passenger seat, and I had to drive down, and they had a little island you could pull into and pull mail something. And I totally spaced as I was going by it. And I got caught up with something on the radio. And the next thing I know, I'm like 2 blocks down the street. And being male, I didn't want to turn around and go back and backtrack. So I thought, well, I gotta pay this bill. And I took a right on Balcones, and I'm driving. And suddenly, I was just looking around, and I noticed a mailbox in an office complex, one of those office complexes on Balcones. Now, conservatively speaking, I'd probably driven by that mailbox, I don't know, 1,000 times, and never noticed that it was there. Suddenly, I need to mail a letter, and bang, there's a mailbox, right? I mean, the motivational system is tuning what you see. And it's affecting it both at a specific level of things that will actually help you to achieve the goal, like a mailbox, as well as generally finding you all the positive stuff when you're looking for some desirable goal that you're trying to achieve, or all the negative stuff when there's some undesirable goal. Now, what does this mean for you? Well, one of the things it means is that if you're trying to affect people's behavior and they are in an avoidance mode and they have this generalized focus, which is called a prevention focus. If you have this prevention focus, then I'm going to have to work really hard to make you see some of the positive information that's in the world that might lead you to believe that you could succeed at what it is I'm trying to get you to succeed at. And partly I have to really beat you with it. I have to really make sure that it's prominent. And partly I have to find ways to dampen the activity of that avoidance goal that is preventing you from seeing the positive things that are out there. And similarly, right, if somebody's in the throes of this approach goal and they have what's called a promotion focus, Now, one of the things I need to do is to help them to see the potential negatives. And this is, by the way, why it's hard to get that person to sign the prenup, right? Because in order to do that, you have to start talking to them about all the stuff that's going to go wrong, which you don't want to be the one to burst their bubble, right? So you just kind of let it go until later when you go, I told you so. So we've got approach and avoidance, which generalizes to this idea of promotion, where you generally see the positive stuff, and prevention, where you generally see the negative stuff. Now I'm going to layer one more piece on top of this, which is a concept that is called regulatory fit, which has been studied in a bunch of labs. Tori Higgins has played with it. My lab has played with it. The idea behind regulatory fit is that if you are in one of these modes, the promotion mode where you're seeing everything as positive, the prevention mode where you're seeing all the negative, then you feel better when the world fits your expectations. So here's an interesting thing. You might think, right, that if you're in this prevention mode, right, that where you would feel most comfortable is in an environment where there are good things out there that would tell you you don't have to worry so much. But in fact, the opposite happens. You feel most comfortable in those situations in which the world fits your expectations. So if you think there are demons out there, and then you see there are demons out there, you're like, see, your motivational system is like, see, I told you, it's dangerous. Imagine, for example, a world in which there was like a radio host who was constantly spinning conspiracy theories about how terrible the world was. Now just imagine this, okay? You know, I mean, like in a city like Austin, I mean, let's really throw it out there. Could you imagine somebody in Austin spinning conspiracy theories telling you that the world is a horrible place? Now, what does this mean? It means you've got this prevention focus. So when do you feel best? When you get evidence that the world is in fact dangerous, that there's crazy stuff going on. It really can build on itself, okay? And when you hear the more positive things, you discount them because they don't feel comfortable within the motivational state you have right now. And likewise, the opposite happens. If you're in one of these promotion states where you're focused on all of the gains in the world, when you are confronted with a significant piece of information that's negative, you're uncomfortable in that situation. Because that piece of information does not fit with your regulatory mode, with your motivational state at that moment. Now this matters because how many times have you had to sit down with somebody and try to convince them to do something, right? Here we are, people who are interested in creating behavior change, and you say to somebody, don't you understand what you're doing to yourself? Right? How could you eat that much? Or how could you take those drugs or whatever it is? How could you do that? You're hurting yourself. But in that moment, if they're in a promotion focus and everything is good, that piece of information that you confront them with makes them feel really negative at that moment, and so they avoid that information. They push it away, right? It's uncomfortable to be in that situation, and they gravitate towards the information that's in the mode that they're in, which means that once you understand what mode someone is in, you also need to present them with information that is cast in the same mode that they're in the moment. So if you came across somebody who was in the throes of a conspiracy theory in which everything was negative, in which they had significant concerns, what you need to do is not to say, the world is wonderful. What you need to say is, no, this is what you need to fear. Right? You need to find things that are in the language that is going to comport with the way that they are experiencing the world motivationally. Yeah?
How dynamic are these different states, and are they contextual as well?
Yeah, so are they contextual, right? And the answer is yes, provided that there isn't something out there that is dominating, or something internally that's dominating. So So if you look at the literature, what they talk about is that there's both what they call a chronic focus, which is each of us has a bit of a different tuning. Some of us are naturally tuned towards approach. Some of us are naturally tuned towards avoidance. And if you meet people in the world, you know that, right? There are some people, my mom, for example, is one of the 6 most anxious people on planet Earth, okay? So everything is calamity, right, for her. I thought I was an anxious kid until I left home. And then I realized I was just the child of a very anxious kid. So there's definitely a set point, but then on top of that, each of us has contexts that will create a particular mode. So I might be the sort of person who is very, I tend to be very approach-oriented, but if there's something going wrong at work, I mean seriously wrong at work, then I will enter that avoidance mode and notice all kinds of horrible stuff in that period. Yeah?
In these modes that you're referring to, is there a change in brain chemistry, like a favoritism towards a certain kind of neurotransmitter, or other even more essential characteristics?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, the answer to that question is, so the question is there a change in the brain, basically? And the answer is yes, there has to be, right? I mean, that is the brain does everything the brain controls everything that we're doing, right? So yes, given the consistency of the behavioral results, there is a difference in the brain. Those differences are somewhat subtle, at least at some level, right? We know, for example, that the amygdala will go crazy in seriously fearful situations, for example. So there are certain things you can measure very broadly when what we tend to do in experiments isn't just to create a little bit of stress. We tend to scare the crap out of people, right? I mean, because you want to get the biggest effect in order to be able to measure it. So, at the margins, there are some very big differences, right? But, for most of our lives, we're not utterly fearful, so stressed we can't operate, so elated we can barely speak. And so, at that point, the differences are more subtle. They still involve some of that same circuitry, but there isn't like a pill we could give. I mean, part of the fundamental problem with this is that anything that is controlled by a single neurotransmitter system, we can already fix, right? So Parkinson's involves a degradation of the substantia nigra. You're not producing dopamine, and at least for a while you can give people that dopamine, or now actually implant stuff to create more dopamine that will counteract the effects, at least for a while, until you do it too much and make people schizophrenic. But those are simple ones. A lot of this stuff is much more subtle and involves the nature of the circuitry. And so it would be great if we could just create an approach pill, right? Although even there, we got to be careful, right? Sometimes the world is dangerous. I mean, any tool that we have in our toolbox is there in part because it works sometimes, right? It's just we like to be able to tune ourselves in ways that allow us to function effectively in many ways as possible, which is why if you look at the clinical literature on things like anxiety disorders and depression, the best, most effective long-term treatments tend to be drug treatments combined with behavioral treatments, where you get people off the precipice, right, so that they're able to function, and then you help to teach them strategies that are essentially allowing them to retune some of the circuitry, right? So drugs alone tend not to work. Behavior alone doesn't always work, particularly if the symptoms are so extreme that someone just can't function, but that combination can be really effective. Yeah?
Yeah, but like you said, happiness and sadness are two emotions, but the physiological changes in both these emotions are the same. So what are the difference between the motivation thing? Because the physiology is the same.
Well, okay, that's a great question. So happy, sad, the physiology with respect to the motivational system is the same. That is, the motivational system is in an approach mode. I wanted to achieve this great thing, and then I failed, right? So if you're probably a member of the Cleveland Cavaliers in about 2 weeks, you'll have the towel over your head, okay? I'm just guessing. I don't bet on my basis here. But so you will have had this approach motivation, but you will have failed at your goal, and so you'll be sad. And so the physiology, some of the physiology is the same, right? The physiology related to the motivational state is the same. The activation of the motivational system is the same, but because you failed, right? There's other concepts in there that end up influencing other physiological reactions, right? So I am feeling bad. I mean, sadness, fear, stress, those negative emotions are actually, they're physically painful, right? I mean, there's a reason why we go out of our way to try to avoid situations that make us sad. I mean, except every once in a while when you want to see a weepy movie. Or to avoid situations that are fearful in the long term. Again, every once in a while we'll do something exciting that is a little bit fearful because it engages us. But in large doses, we tend to avoid those, which is why, for example, people procrastinate for tasks like how many of you avoid going to the dentist or the doctor? Anybody? Why would you do that, right? I mean, the dentist's going to help you. The doctor's going to help you. So why do you avoid it? Because you might get bad news, right? Or experience pain in your mouth. And so you don't want to do that. And so you just avoid even thinking about it for as long as possible, right? And there's very low compliance with medical tests that might yield bad news for the same reason. Right, so there's both similarities and differences in the physiology. Similarities in the motivational systems activation, differences in the systems that are involved in the interpretation of the world and the subsequent emotional reaction. Yeah.
So in behavior design, we talk a lot about failure recovery.
Mm-hmm.
So when someone is sad, can we address it with both states? Maybe if someone is sad and you want to get them back onto a trajectory, how do you use the approach system to help them get back on? Because creating a habit is hundreds of little successes. Right?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So how can you help people who have experienced a failure of some kind? And so, right, so one of the things that you want to do that I think is really important is to recognize which state they're in, and then to try to find a fit with their state. So somebody who, for example, I've had this. The very first time that I wanted to write a book in the popular sphere, I wrote this whole draft of the book, and I was really excited about it, and then I sent it to an agent. The agent said, "This sucks." And I was sad. Because I wasn't fearful, I was just sad, right? I was like, what? I wrote this whole thing. And, and so what I had to focus on was desirable things that I still wanted to achieve. I had to focus on, well, what are some, that actually now this gives me a chance to do some more writing, and I like to write, and I could engage with some other people, and let me focus on the two good things that agent said to me, and build from there. And so, getting that first book published required actually many rejections, right? But in each case, those rejections for me caused sadness because there was this desirable thing I wanted that I wasn't able to get. And so I had to keep focusing on, well, we got closer this time. There were 4 good comments this time, right? And work from there. But you can do the same sort of thing on the other side, right? Somebody who's really stressed about things, you can say, well, it could be worse, right? And really focus on, well, let's keep at it because, at least in the short term, let's keep at it because, if you don't keep at it, then things are going to go downhill. Now, I still think, right, in the long term, somebody who lives on that avoidance axis, you still want to work with them at times when the motivational system isn't deeply engaged. So, like, you've probably argued with a spouse, partner, friend when they're really down about something. Reframing the situation for them in that moment never works because they just think you're a jerk, okay? But later, when, as the saying goes, cooler heads prevail, there is an opportunity for what the clinicians call reappraisal, where you help people to see the same situation in a different way. And so in those situations, for those people who live on that avoidance axis of things, you want to help them to see, there are some other ways we can think about this situation that are more desirable, that might give rise to more opportunities for joy, satisfaction, happiness. the emotions you'd like to experience. Yeah, there and then there.
So, suppose you are married to somebody who freaks out every time a cockroach shows up.
Okay, so you have this friend.
Yeah. and suppose, so to deal with this, and you say, well, it's just an insect, like,
Yeah.
that doesn't work, obviously. So you say what you should really be worried about is the snake behind the refrigerator.
Yeah, yes. Well, actually, what you should say is, I know that thing scares you, but, it's probably carrying disease, so let's get it out of here. Right? I mean, now it's like, well, that's worse. So now I'm gonna get rid of it, because as scary as that thing is sitting there, I really don't want disease in my house, so I'm gonna get rid of it. Yeah.
So actually, to piggyback on that, and actually your previous story about the book, in the moment where you were faced with your first rejection, is that, well, I guess it's kind of, the second question would be, can you be in two modes at the same time, or kind of use motivations of two modes at the same time? Because it seems to me, kind of with the cockroach example, then it's like, okay, well, if I just got rejected, my first instinct is to never feel like this ever again. So you may want to, go into your cave or that sort of feeling, right?
Yeah.
So would you then go, okay, well, since I'm afraid of stepping out there again and feeling like this again, maybe what I should really fear is dying in unpublished author, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Did you kind of do that?
That's a good question, right? So what, I mean, so the issue is when things play out over time, right, what happens? And so one of the first things to recognize is when you're in deeply into a very aroused emotional state, sadness, fear, whatever, if that arousal isn't going to be useful, right? So if you have to steel yourself to smack the heck out of that cockroach, then maybe having a little arousal might work. But if what you ultimately need to do is to like rewrite something where being hyper aroused isn't going to help, actually the first thing you need to do is go out and take a walk or go for a run or something and dissipate the energy, right? Don't punch stuff, by the way, because then you just learn the habit that every time I'm aroused I should get violent. Not so good. But give yourself a way of dissipating the energy, and then sort of see where you are, right? So at that point, you will get a sense of what am I feeling, right? Am I feeling afraid, meaning I don't ever want to experience anything like that again, or am I just feeling sad? And then depending on where you are at that point, then you decide how you want to engage. And I think if you're feeling fearful about ever showing anybody your work again, then what you need to do is to try something like, well, if I never do this, I'm gonna regret never having done this. And in fact, there's some really beautiful work. So Tom Gilovich has done some great studies on the emotion of regret. So it turns out that psychologists, when they started studying regret, they first started by using college sophomores because they are the fruit flies of psychology research. They are cheap and plentifully available on college campuses. And if you ask your typical college sophomore what they regret, it is almost universally dumb things that they did, right? I regret saying this thing to a friend. I regret cheating on this test. I regret drinking too much and crashing my dad's car, whatever it is, right? Stuff they did. What Gilovich did was actually to go to old age homes and to ask people what they regret. So you take people in their 80s and 90s and you ask them what they regret, it's heavily weighted towards the stuff they didn't do, right? It's heavily weighted towards, I wish I'd learned to salsa dance, I wish I'd learned to play a musical instrument, I should have asked that little red-haired girl to dance, or whatever it is, right? And in fact, in your 80s and 90s, most of those dumb things you did have just become really good stories with the passage of time, right? So you get this shift in perspective. And the reason that that's important is because human beings have a remarkable capacity for mental time travel, which means that you can actually say to people, I want you to project yourself to the end of your life, look back, and ask yourself, what will you regret? And that's actually a useful way of getting people energized to do things that they might not ordinarily have the energy to do. In fact, when I read about this research, I played this game, and I was talking about this with a few people when I walked in, but I took up the saxophone about 16 years ago, and did it in part because I read some of this research and I went, well, what would I regret? Well, I would regret never learning how to play the saxophone. Well, what's holding me back? And it turns out what was holding me back was that when I was 10 years old, I asked my mom if I could play the sax, or actually I asked her if I could play this French horn. And she said, no, we bought a piano and you play the piano. So basically I never learned to play another musical instrument because when I was 10, I asked my mom if I could play another one and she said no. And I decided in my mid-30s it wasn't her fault anymore.
Yeah, I just want to know why sometimes the action on both the spheres, like tears of joy, tears of happiness, why they are the same at both the spheres?
Yeah. So physiologically, it turns out that there aren't that many physiological reactions that we can have, right? Which is why the underlying motivational state is such an important determinant in interpreting the emotion. So a lot of the work, a lot of the theories of emotion these days are what are called appraisal theories, which means you have a feeling, right? So the activity of the motivational state, the motivational system gives rise to a feeling. And then you have to interpret that feeling in order to figure out what the emotion is, okay? And so, so you know, there are a lot of similarities among the various physiological responses. And so you end up telling a story about what it is that you're feeling, which is why, for example, you could have a really hard day at work and then come home and snap at one of the kids. Right? You just annoyed me. No, you know, this colleague at work annoyed you 3 hours ago, but you're sort of looking for something, and so, you know, the first available thing, which happens to be the kid who didn't clean up his room, you know, is the one who gets the who gets the wrath. And so, you know, and so if you think then about the physiological responses, I mean, for example, tears, you know, they happen with almost every intense emotion. Right? So when you have a very intense emotion, happy, sad, fearful, surprised, you will get tears, right? Laughter, right? It's a reflection actually more of the intensity than anything else, right? And so there's just a limited number of these physiological, you know, the pit in your stomach that you get, is that fear, stress, love, right? I mean, which is it, right? I mean, you get some very similar kinds of states for a lot of these emotions, right? In fact, the earliest study that was done on this kind of appraisal work was a classic study by these guys, Dutton and Irion. And they did this study at a national park in Canada. And the park had a tour, right, through this beautiful area. And part of the tour went across a bridge on a valley between two mountains. And so what they did was they manipulated the route that the tour took. Okay, so it either was on this big concrete and steel bridge, or else it was on this kind of rickety wooden chain link thing. Okay, so people on the rickety chain link thing, they got a little aroused, Now, here's what they did. The participants in this experiment, unbeknownst to them, were the male participants who went on this tour. The tour guide was an attractive young woman, and at the end of the tour, they gave people an opportunity in a variety of ways to express attraction for the tour guide, like asking for her phone number to get more information, actually calling that number, things like that. And what they found was that the people who went across that rickety bridge were more likely to express attraction for the tour guide than the people who went across the concrete and steel bridge. The idea is that they had this vaguely unsettled, aroused feeling. They're not quite sure where it came from. They get to the end of the tour, they're looking around for a reason, and they go, must be you. Right? So there's a lot of room for people to interpret what's happening because, you know, remember, a lot of this stuff that's happening deep in the motivational system is opaque to everything that's, you know, to all that great storytelling apparatus we have on the outside. What time is it?
It's 7:22.
7:22. So why don't we take one more question, and then I can stick around for a few minutes and talk to people. I brought some books in case anybody wants to buy a book and get a signature. But we have one more question in the back.
I just wanted to add another kind of experiment related to this kind of telling stories to ourselves when there was a man sitting in a room with adrenaline injection, and there was a guy sitting nearby, and so depending on whether the guy was informed, that reaction was actually put into the because this neighbor was irritated.
Yeah.
But I really wonder it's only the stories we're telling. So how can we even leverage any control?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So how, given all of this complexity, can we ever hope to change anyone's behavior? And the answer is to remember that one size is never going to fit all. And that a lot of what we need to do, if we're going to successfully influence people's behavior, is to begin by understanding how they're motivated. Which means we need to gather information from people. We need to know, do you sit on that approach axis or avoidance axis? Are you paying more attention to the positive things or the negative things? And until you know that, it's hard to know how to frame the messages to people. It's hard to, you know, and you need to know how aroused they are at the moment, right? I mean, you catch somebody who's hyper aroused, that is a bad time to start trying to influence their behavior. Even if they're really aroused in the direction that you want them to go, it's a bad time to start. Because because just like that person who's about to go get married, they are overrepresenting one whole part of the world. They are forgetting how hard it's going to be to do what they want to do. So somebody, for example, who decided, I'm going to stop drinking. I'm never going to drink again. Right? I mean, how many people do you know who drink too much and say, I'm never going to drink again? And then like 3 days later, they're drinking again. Right? Because in that moment, they're very engaged in that goal, and they just can't see a circumstance in which things would go otherwise. And the fact is, right, in order to help people change their behavior, they have to be aware of everything that can go wrong and to plan for that. And they're not going to be in a mindset to be able to plan for that when they're hyper aroused like that. Right? So we need people to be engaged, but not so engaged that they can't see the other side of the question. Anyhow, I guess with that, thanks so much for listening. I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Art, for coming out. If you want to move, I was thinking if you come to the back right, there's a couple folks sitting here. Maybe you could share space with Art, and you could, Alan, if you could help Art bring the books over, then there won't be conflict with people getting beer. So we still have, we're going to have some more conversation after this, but let's take a few minutes now to get beer. Did I mention that there's beer back in the back of the room? No, but more importantly, Art's around for just a few more minutes with books and signing and questions, which will be back in the back right-hand corner of the room. So, and there are bathrooms out and to the right, so let's take 10 minutes or so being a little bit more pick your own adventure style here, and then we'll come back together again to have a discussion, okay? Thank you. Excellent. You're on the camera. You're on the camera. I was. I didn't realize. Just the back of my head. Yeah, I know it's all right. What's going on, man?
I wasn't planning to.
Yeah, they have like, my favorite one is,
The other one they have bacon. They have bacon.
yeah, I've seen that one.
Another one they had a big cranberry.
That's why I was glad you liked it. Nice.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, yeah.
How you doing?
Yeah,
Jumps back and forth, so. Okay. Thanks for coming. Yeah.
Is he your account?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
What's your, are you,
It is every time.
No. We're an independent consultant, so sometimes we're traveling all over. So, I have way to travel. So, no, I can't.
and if you're on,
Oh, yeah. Have you ever met Markman? Oh, I haven't met him personally. I went to one of his last
Check that. Let's count
right, if you can pull it back together again, grab your beers, come back to find a seat. We're going to just do a couple more phases of our evening. First off, we're going to have an open conversation about what we learned and how we might apply that. If you're in the back and you can hear me, tap somebody on the shoulder who doesn't hear me. Heather, can you help get the folks in the back, please? We're coming back to the seats now. All right, back to the seats. Okay. So, normally we have this sort of open time networking in the beginning as people are wandering in, but we had an accommodating arts schedule. We did it in the middle a little bit and lost half our crowd. So, but that's okay. Everybody who's still here, you're going to leave smarter than they are. Okay. So who? Yes. Good point. What surprised you tonight? Was there something that stuck out with somebody here that made them go aha? Any aha moments?
Yeah, just in general, of when you're dealing with somebody that's got a problem and you're trying to help them, understanding that most of the time you're going to be doing the wrong thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that was interesting.
I have a viewpoint now when I'm dealing with an individual that is in an irretractable position, that I'll be less frustrated.
Yeah, that's a good point in general. It's really common. So, in years and years and years of working with teams on designing on behavior change, it's very common for a team to get to some point where they get really frustrated and even start mocking the audience they're designing for, because at some point you begin to start blaming them for not using the great stuff you've made. So any sort of things like that help have better insight into that it's a situation, it's not the person, that fundamental attribution error, avoiding that. Yes?
So what happens like when you're focused on a vision, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have a team of people,
Mm-hmm.
but everybody is focused on a vision, right?
Right.
And it's not really like you versus me.
Right.
We're all focused towards a vision, a greater vision,
Right.
and the potential impact it can have on the industry or people around you.
Right.
So what happens in that case? Does the motivation still flag? Or are you truly inspired even when you're reaching closer to your vision, for example?
But are you asking if that kind of, say like a CEO or something or leader of a team is inspiring the team around this great vision? Does that work? And is there a risk of that as you get close to that?
Yeah, so what
that
happens
energy.
to the approach mind, right?
Right.
Approaching mindset, I guess.
Right.
And as you're getting closer to the vision, you're still inspired. You have a team of people, you've been working for few years.
I think Art was pointing out that in studies that the relative strength of approach as you get closer is not as strong as fear. So, but I think that's going to be more manifest. Heather, you should come up and join us.
Oh,
as
sure.
well.
You need an assist.
Exactly. More than that. I need a partner up here.
Hey guys.
If you have thoughts on. So it's not that that approach will stop working as you get close to the goal. It's just that it's not as powerful as fear is. Fear scares you more as you get close to it, right? So the fear is salient and being worried about, now we're successful and I'm going to have to speak to larger crowds as a CEO, or what if this doesn't work and we screw up a bunch of people's lives as we launch this product, or certain fears are going to start to play out more. But it's not that the approach method still doesn't work.
Okay, and what I would say that, I'm not sure what your goal is in mind, but
as just a former founder and a person who's owned companies and sold them, try to understand which parts of your team are avoidance and which parts are approach, and leverage both capabilities. Your approach people are going to go towards the goal. The avoidance people are going to try to avoid not getting there. And your avoidance people might be people like your accountant. They could be people like your financial advisor. They could be your IT security people. They could be the people who are trying to help you not screw up massively. Those people get really pommeled by the approach people, because the approach people are salespeople. And so the salespeople and the people that are go-getters are shaking their pom-poms really hard and doing, flips. And the avoidance people are like, hey, but this could go wrong. And they're considered anathema, right? Like, what do you mean? We're going towards this goal. So I would say, and this is something, I guess, one of the Roosevelt guys, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, I don't know. But he said, bring me the heretic, right? So if some of your avoidance people are trying to keep you from fucking up, then you need to listen to them and provide a platform where they can speak and plan around those failure points.
That was probably Teddy.
Who was it, Teddy? I'm not a history person, so thank you.
He's got the internet, so he is.
I think that's all I have to say on that subject. It's just both are really important, and as a CEO, providing a platform for the minority voice is really important, and utilizing their expert knowledge to plan your way around certain failure points.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Other thoughts, things that surprised you, things that you're like, oh, I should use that in my work. Okay.
I find it rather interesting that if you think about how many businesses and marketing people that conflate these two dimensions that are trying to very specifically make orthogonal to one another in terms of having something sadness and happiness and stress and relief, is that in marketing the whole notion of happiness and relief overlap and stress and sadness overlap, and those aren't really well disambiguated in terms of how to present to the public. So I think I'm curious if that is a good opportunity for businesses to really reevaluate how they're presenting themselves in terms of which need they're addressing, rather than trying to address both at the same time.
Yeah, I found that actually quite interesting as well. Anybody have any thoughts on that? That's a
So separating those two dimensions and crafting more specific campaigns.
But we tend to think of approach and avoidance emotions in general. Like, I don't want to be sad, so I might, in marketing or in any kind of motivation, sort of accentuate any one of these negative emotions as something I want to get away from, and then create the tension with, hey, this product or this opportunity or whatever can lead to these positive emotions. But we don't usually split on whether the audience could potentially be approach avoidance or
And I would think that if it is indeed people who are sort of by nature avoidance oriented,
right.
trying to appeal to them by happiness is ultimately going to be counterproductive.
Yes.
You want to
Right.
appeal to them by going after sort of the negative adversarial outcomes they don't buy your product, rather than trying to appeal to them by what they could accomplish. And likewise, if you have other people, you want to appeal to the positive side. So very different strategies and almost counterproductive to one another to try to hit both at the same time.
Right. So part of it's segmentation,
And testing.
testing to see
Yeah.
whether your audience responds to one or the other. It's, I mean, that general question is very interesting.
Maybe similar to that is like the whole way how you present any product. Like this is to help you do something, or this particular function is to not make you do something, to avoid
something, sure.
to getting into some kind of situation.
Sure. I mean, to some degree, that is. Any other thoughts on that in the audience?
I have the thought that you have to approach someone with a message that matches the mode they're in, right?
Right.
And so if somebody's in a very positive mode and an approach, then they're not even going to hear messages that you're targeting at those folks that are in avoidance, right? So you sometimes need multiple messages to reach the broader audience.
Right. And you do get, I mean, the example Art gave about the doom and gloom radio hosts, that all the things that are advertised on those channels are also avoidance based. So sometimes the channel or the media is coming from a source that everything is already segmented along that axis, which is interesting. And I imagine that probably happens on places like social media and that when it's slowly honing in on what you keep liking.
Well, didn't YouTube run into that crosswise lately? In terms of having negative messages and people not wanting to be showing up in their advertising next to those videos.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a whole other.
But I think it was shown that it was like mostly fake, like it was just kind of like exaggeration by the media that those channels had any significant ad revenue.
So the whole drama was cooked up to make for a story.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we're seeing this play out in media a lot. This issue of there's a big issue, a big problem with humans being so focused on fear and avoidance in the short term, or overly focused on that. So if you're trying to drive people to watch your show that's airing tonight, or to vote for somebody specific, or to do any like short-term behavior, then scaring the hell out of them is a great way to do it. And unfortunately, everybody's who's trying to motivate people has found that out. So you've got a lot of different, everything from press especially, but all kinds of organizations are using fear and panic. So you get people concocting stories of creating drama like this over something that's not even really true. So.
And I think the story also resulted in YouTube having to take certain action, and the action that they decided to take is not to show any ads on less popular channels. So it basically kind of like backfires to the whole community, because now it will be much more difficult to start a YouTube channel because you're not going to be shown any ads because of that whole media controversy.
Oh wow, yeah, that's kind of a bummer.
Nothing good can happen, right?
Other thoughts? On a different topic, what else? Hey, go ahead.
It seems like a lot of the companies like Coca-Cola or Nike, all these guys, they sell like joy and happiness, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they're buying that product. So it depends on the product, I guess. And there are some other companies like pharmaceutical companies and such, or insurance companies, for example, right? They want to project or show you what happens in the worst case scenario and why you want yourself to recover. So that's another kind of approach.
I was surprised there was no talk about the things that like gamification tries to use as a motivator and get behavior that you want. Not necessarily how to implement it, but the type of motivations that come out of that sort of engagement. I thought there would have been more to that.
Well, we certainly talk about it within the community a lot, but probably just not enough time to
you're
cover
the
it all.
expert on that.
But it's a good question, yeah.
I saw a Nova Science Now program with David Poe, and they gave two examples, Eterna and Fold It. So it's protein folding using crowdfunded intelligence. And that was
Yeah.
a way to use gamification to do something useful and productive as opposed to just being a time spender.
Yeah, it's a great example of using a kind of useful gamification. So they made a game out of something that was hard to get software to be able to figure out, and how proteins fold, and made it something that
I call that functional social media.
functional social media. Yeah, it was. What's that?
Intuitive pattern matching, innate pattern matching that we all have as a toddler, just being able to engage with that, make
Right.
it fun, so people persist with it long enough to get useful data out of it, and doing it in a large enough sample size that you can error correct in a large enough.
Yeah, right. Who has who's been trying to figure out how do I use this in my own work on stuff I'm working on? Do you want to share and see whether as a group we have some ideas on what you were thinking about there?
Yeah, so I run Facebook ads to stuff that's actually kind of positive, like more approach, like, hey, I want this product, like a car or like a shirt. But actually what's interesting is the whole regret idea is interesting, because you could still use the avoidance of regret that you didn't get the shirt. So it's kind of going back to your question, it's that I feel like you probably could put both messages in the same, ad, by, and then everybody would focus on what they want. So you have this positive vision, and then you say, and then act now so you don't regret it, sort of thing. And then everybody can use their own motivation to do that. But you don't have to be like, oh, everyone's gonna laugh at you if you don't have the shirt. You don't have to go that far. You could just say, you know, you're not gonna get this positive outcome and miss out on it. So I think that's kind of what I got from this latter portion of the discussion. But actually earlier, I was wondering whether during the week you could have more messaging that's like regret, and then during the weekend you can have more messaging that's more heavily on the
Interesting.
Approach. Because I think as a society we're more approach during the weekend and more maybe avoidance during the week, unfortunately.
And then depending upon whether it's near Christmas or near an election or near, what's important to remember in all of these psychological effects is that it varies by, I mean, they're all more complex than can possibly be verbalized or written out on a sheet of paper. So in the end, it does come down to testing, which of course is the awesome thing about being able to do, you know, split testing on ads and emails and things like that. So you can test those kinds of things out. But the reality is always a little bit more fuzzy. But it's true that your average ad tends to pull on both the approach and avoidance side of things. But in any particular case, it could well be that it pegs hard one way or the other, or you know, you shouldn't touch one or you shouldn't touch the other, or you should combine the two. Or it's really interesting about the weekends and the week. And
Try
during
it.
the day.
Tell us what happens.
Exactly. Report back next month.
Back.
Back here?
I was just curious too, since we're in a room full of designers, it's like, it's not just design, but it's also like content strategy, and so I'm wondering, you know, if anyone else would be interested in sharing like what they're working on, as I thought what you were talking about was pretty interesting, so, you know, is anyone else doing things that are moving towards this sort of behavioral design, either visual design, UX, or content strategy that you'd be willing to talk about?
Yeah, so in general, you're curious about people working in,
Or video, yeah, what are you guys up to?
not necessarily limited to this evening's topic, but using behavioral science in general. Go ahead.
So I'm with a startup called Karma Pond, and we're all about helping friends find their perfect job. And so one of the things that we're doing is trying to encourage people to share job opportunities that they may know about and could be insiders to help other people do. And so as we get these new job opportunities, we want people to forward it to their friends, to like think about who could really benefit from this and forward it on, even though they might not get an immediate, you know, payback from that. Sending it to somebody else who could really benefit from it would. So getting people to think beyond just themselves, like, oh, okay, this isn't a good fit for me, but do I know somebody that it could be a good fit for? And how to encourage people to do that, to make that possible.
So we know from the literature that just helping somebody else out releases feel-good neurotransmitters in yourself, and so that already has it. It's hard to be altruistic without actually getting a payback yourself out of it. So that's the benefit you're getting there. You're building your social network, showing value, getting social points from it. So there's a variety of ways of, you know, maximizing that in design, but sounds like a good thing to get into. Yeah. Other thoughts? Anyone want to piggyback on his or share what they're doing?
I'm with a nonprofit group trying to form a secular community in Austin. And usually most of our things end up being all white guys. And we'd like it to be a lot more diverse, but how do you do that? That's the problem. So I'm thinking about, you know, obviously sending some stuff out on Facebook, a meetup, is going to that audience mainly, apparently. And, you know, people sign up for meetup things, but, you know, we had, 180 people signed up for tonight, and we got fewer than 100, I think. And so.
74 to be exact.
There you go. So that happens in all of these meetup groups. Apparently people like the idea of something, and they will say they like, and they're gonna come to it, and then they don't. And how do you deal with
something, right?
Something. I mean, so how do you find out what you could have done, if anything, to draw these people in that thought it was a good idea, but then didn't actually show up? And that thing about the avoidance stuff, that's something to think about, you know, that maybe many of the people in the community that we're addressing are somewhat introverted, and you get up to the time of actually getting up and going to see these people that you don't know, maybe that's the avoidance thing going on there.
Well, I don't think you necessarily have to do something about it. I mean, like, some organizers, they tell me and they complain that, you know, like 100 people RSVP and only 50 show up. So they wanna start charging for RSVPing so that everyone who RSVP showed up. And
Well,
I think
they
that's
have
a
to
wrong
understand the
solution.
base rate. They
Yeah,
have to
but I
understand the
think-
base rate of RSVP to active copies.
Right, so you just-
50% is great.
Right, so you just
Yeah.
account for the fact that like only 50% are gonna show up. You don't have to solve anything.
Right.
And if
So
you
when
ever
you
get
just
in a
like,
situation where 80% show up and you can't deal with it, right? That's when you can learn something.
With volunteers.
Okay, well, when we get 180 people RSVP to something, that would be great if only half of them show up.
So yes, it's typical, of course, that large percentage of any step along any path of behavior, you're
Right.
losing people, you're leaking people, and you look for where the big drop is. But that doesn't negate the question: how do you prevent as much leakage as possible? That's where the big part of our game
And
comes
do you
from.
do something different to kind of, to avoid the drop off?
Right.
Is there something like some follow-up or something that you need to do? Like, I must have gotten 4 emails in the past 2 days
I'm your
from
favorite
Heather,
scammer,
who
Anna.
said, okay, come, don't forget, you're going to,
Right.
and more than half of them did forget, or something.
Right.
Well, it's a sales funnel, just like anything, right? So this is where we are at the bottom.
I'd like to keep on this subject. Are you gonna?
Eventbrite at all for that event? Are you using Eventbrite at all for that event?
Eventbrite, no.
A lot of meets, like, I don't know, this one here, they use Eventbrite, and it has a way of notifying politely, hey, this event's gonna come up, you don't wanna miss it, and it'll do like one a day before, one like 6 hours before, one 3 hours before, one an hour before, and it does it I don't know, the way they've been timing algorithm is it's perfect, I don't feel like I'm getting spammed,
I've heard that.
and they're always constructive, and it says, hey, and it gives you a Google map, and saying this is how long it'll take you in traffic, and it's all these elegant APIs from different companies working together in this, almost a symphonic way of, here's the
Trying to
data.
reduce the friction.
but I think Eventbrite it also doesn't let you actually.
More beats since getting plugged back into that in a long time.
I just think that people just commit without even thinking. They say, I'm gonna attend, and that's it, just instant accepting, I'm gonna come, and they just don't show up.
And
It
Yeah, and
just
Eventbrite doesn't actually
happens.
let you on RSVP, so it
Yeah.
doesn't let you uncommit. So.
Well,
So
yeah,
who here is?
Meetup sends out a notice when I announce it, 6 days before
Right.
and 1 day before. And now, if you change your RSVP to no, somehow there's a hook. I get this thing that
And Heather and I are
it
still
still
gonna send you
says on,
emails.
you know, I get a Google thing that says, oh, you're going to such and such, even though no. Anyway, there's some interesting weird stuff there, but the Eventbrite.
It seems to do it a little bit more frequently. I've had to use both Meetup and Eventbrite. I seem to have a better time with Eventbrite.
Isn't it a little more complicated to employ Eventbrite?
I haven't used I need to look into that, but it seems like from the user standpoint, it's a lot more, it seems like it's more cohesive, for lack of a better term on it.
I've heard that a lot of meetups do both, so that's something we'll be looking at too.
I use Eventbrite, over 400 people, and it is very resource consumptive when you get to large quantities of people.
It's
And
hard to,
Well.
resource intensive to.
Yeah, when you're trying to manage new check-ins and make sure that they're on the list, if you have it, becomes really resource intensive, where you've
Right.
got to balloon your volunteers just to cope
That's
with,
challenging, yeah.
with the surge that comes through.
That's because you're trying to sign up people as they come in the door and all that kind of
That
stuff.
could be it, it
Yeah.
could be pre-existing signups, it's also because the nature of meetings being scheduled at a start time, that leads to a surge,
Right.
so.
Okay, so how many of you have ever RSVP'd to an event that you didn't go to? All of it. Okay, so let's just try to get some data here.
You've gone to every one?
I don't
She's that
RSVP.
one that makes the rest of us.
Well, one of it
I
is.
saved myself the whole guilt trip.
One of the problems is that if you're the organizer, you set up a thing, even though you know you're not going to that particular thing, you have to, you're RSVP'd, yes, you're going. And so there are things that I have no intention of going to.
But you organize
But,
them?
yeah, well, I'm the organizer and I put it, like, we have this family group. And my kids are all adults,
Right.
so I'm not going to a thing for, 7-year-olds.
But that's a small case.
Yeah,
Let's look at the
so-
big cases. What are the main reasons that you haven't come to an event you RSVP'd for?
Something better came up.
Yeah, something else comes up, something higher priority comes up.
So this is competition neglect. We do
Okay.
this with almost everything. Yeah.
There's also very little cost for not showing up.
That's
Right.
right. It's easy
There's
to
free pizza.
yes. So we need more bribery. So you say
Increase
another
Increase
event
the
has-
reward,
then
increase
becomes
the
a,
reward.
an
Yeah.
approach,
I was
right?
kidding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's good, increase the reward.
It's amazing how
Yeah.
much people respond to free food. It's crazy.
It's amazing.
What do you think are some other big reasons, just the sort of shout
I
out?
would say because
time.
by definition, the RSVP is a binary decision. It's yes or no.
Right.
There's no way to indicate I'm 70% likely to come.
Right.
So
Sure.
effectively, you're making a decision what your own threshold is, and you vote accordingly. So
Sure.
it's mainly a flaw in the system, not in the people.
They used to have a maybe
Yeah,
option.
I was gonna
Yeah,
say
but
that.
Yeah.
I've
Those
gotten
are all gonna fail. There's no way to do that right.
Yeah.
The more options you put, the less likely someone will put
Yeah.
anything.
Right.
So
Right.
if you just have yes or no, more people will click yes. Even if you as an organizer, it's frustrating to not know the number, you're gonna get more people actually coming out if you do that. What was your example here?
Me?
Yeah, he was gonna, you were starting to say something,
yeah,
and I
yeah.
told you to pause for a second.
when he said whatever.
Okay, go ahead. You're up.
So, I was thinking that like the novelty kind of wears off, and especially when it kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, where it's far away, you're kind of excited about it, and then when it gets closer, you see all the things you're not gonna get to do.
Right.
Maybe I was gonna
See
catch
a
up on
TV
work.
ad.
So I was thinking maybe one way to battle that is to maybe not say anything about the free food yet. Wait till like 3 days before. So
That's what I
anyways,
did
those-
this time.
What's that?
That's what I did this time.
Oh, that's
Free
awesome.
food?
Yeah.
So-
Beer,
Beer.
beer, come on, people.
But,
Who eats? We all
yeah.
drink.
Speaking of which, the beer was sponsored by Heather's company, Boost Consulting
Yeah.
tonight. You wanna speak on that for a second?
No, I wanna
Okay,
hear
go
about
ahead.
this.
Oh, okay. Well, I kind of want to hear this too, but no. Anyway, but my whole thing is actually it's interesting. You called it, I'm the best spammer, but actually I always thought that it was the best people that like would send you
I
reminders.
said I was the cutest spammer.
Oh, cutest spammer.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I would probably dispute the spam label, because if you're providing a new reason to come every reminder, then it's actually new information, and it's like another way to keep that novelty going. So I think maybe that's a good way to battle that, is every time you send out a reminder, there's another new reason to come and another
makes
thing
more
that you
sense.
might miss out on if you don't come.
And then, like for this particular one, it was a very lengthy, 2.5 hours
Mm-hmm.
of the day that you worked. Some people probably just see it afterwards. For example, I saw at 9 p.m. I'm like,
Yeah.
but it's,
Maybe we shouldn't
Yeah,
have
that's one
nine.
of the things, right?
We do
Or if
always
you
run that
start at
long, but maybe
6:30,
it's
say
long.
networking, have more details, like how structure is gonna be.
Uh-huh.
Because maybe some people wanna go on the first part versus the second,
Mhm.
or they don't wanna network. So that's
So multiple access points, yeah.
just so if
Okay.
they wanna attend different parts, and they cannot come at 6:30, but they can come on the discussion, and they wanna be part of that more than just the lecture.
I'm also more likely to go to a meetup if I know what to expect, just format-wise,
Yeah.
especially if it's the first time I'm going.
So more than just there's gonna be a talk, but like what else is there around it? Is there a discussion? Is there?
What's expected of me?
Uh-huh. Yeah, you don't know that we're gonna have you up here speaking soon.
Basically for me, honestly, the main point is like at the moment when I really kind of decided, well, for starter, when I RSVP, I often RSVP just to put something in a queue, so okay, that's something nice to go or something like that.
Right.
And there is another kind of thing, maybe I'm just making it up, but I have like that idea that people tend to RSVP just because they want to make that nice to organizers, so that like a lot of people will come. So they say,
Sure.
oh, okay, there are gonna be a lot of people,
Yeah.
and so it's so easy, just click yes and that's fine. But at the moment when you really decide before the event, for me how would I fit into the whole kind of event? And when, for example, I say there will be like too many people, or like if the whole event has like a lot of description, very related to the particular meetup, which I may not understand completely, like the whole ideas which will be discussed or something. I would feel like, okay, I may meet nice people there, maybe not. I'm not sure. And if there will be like a bunch of people, what are you gonna? If the whole discussion will be even really interesting, when all the crowd will be kind of shouting and so on and so on, and then I can really think about how I feel about me into that context. So if I would see the photo where there will be like something, okay, here's where you will be in this particular.
You belong here. Yeah.
That might be open a bit of perspective, so I can imagine the whole area, and the people, and something like that. Well, maybe, but still, I can.
We are looking for a photographer, so if you want to be in the in crowd, please.
Yeah,
see me.
somebody to take.
Everyone smile.
Oh, right. What were you gonna say?
Just that a photo helps me. Likewise, the whole Facebook thing of like, your friend is interested in an event, and I'm like, oh, I think I'll go too because I can go with them.
Right. You don't
That's
have to
really
walk into a
helpful.
room by yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, go ahead.
I just want to go back to the point, like, it's about, I think people have touched on it, changing intent into action. So when you first sign up for it, you have an intention, and an intention really isn't that motivating.
Right.
You have an interest, perhaps, in the subject matter, and like Art was talking about tonight, you know, it depends on the mood at that moment. So you might join this at that given time, and then it's a week later, you're like, I'm gonna go to the Y instead or something. So, you know, it's, I think you had some good points about constantly reminding and re-instigating that emotion in the first place is very important.
There's also the
Because if you don't,
documentary
that emotion's fleeting, you know, that intention is fleeting.
And I noticed Eventbrite has got a knack for, it's not spammy, it's like this
I love
key
the walk here.
points along the timeline of, okay, it's good to know about it the day before, because I know, am I gonna be in the right time to take advantage of it? It's transportation costs, like, knowing the hours before, okay, am I doing something in my schedule where I can cover the space the last couple hours? I can position myself where I'm physically close to the event, and a lot less likely to get late. That way that service is really elegant.
So as soon as in an approach mindset, you would have to hit them with whatever rewards that there would be to show up there. But if they're an avoidant mindset, you would probably have to show some sort of cost for not showing up.
Right.
Right.
This is what you're missing. Or it's like if you RSVP and don't show up, you'll be your next one. I don't know, it'd be something like that.
But typically in marketing, we wouldn't have a problem with hitting in both of those messages.
Which
at the
we
same
did
time.
use both messages, by the way.
Yeah.
The last one was don't miss out.
Yeah. Interesting. Sorry, he had to stand up a little bit
I
earlier.
would just, to continue with your thought there, I think one of the things that Art was talking about was the documentary effect of I feel like this is something I ought to do,
Right.
and there's a
Definitely.
certain social association that you want to give,
Right.
that I want to be seen, or I want to associate myself with
I'm in this group
idea.
now, yeah.
Even though when it comes down to it, it's really not that appealing to me, or I'm not likely to choose that,
Right.
give it an alternative. But, you know, I wanna think that I'll see the documentary.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And regarding the whole idea of saying like this, what you can lose in case of you not showing up. Well, I can really would maybe the interesting thing that it really looks like a brag when you say like, oh, we have a food, blah blah blah, and we have a conversation. And we have a food, and we have a beer, and a bit of conversation. So, well, I really want to be associated with people discussing something rather than drinkers. So, when we are in approach mode, it's really better to go, even if you're in avoidance, better to be, highlight the whole kind of the main topics ideas. Like, okay, what you miss, not the pizza, but you'll miss the interesting topic or something like that. But another idea is, after the meetup itself, you can still make a summary of what was going on, make photos and stuff, and send an email like, oh, it's a pity that you haven't had a chance to show up, but take a look what was going on there. So maybe next time, and we'll be so happy. And it's really a pity that you haven't had a chance to.
Like, for example, if you were signing books, that's, for some people will be priceless, right? You can come and buy the book from the author and they will sign it for you.
Yeah.
The special note, that will be a reward for somebody who's in avoidance.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. So if we take it back to first principles in behavior design, essentially people are always trying to decide what to do, whether to do anything at all based on the emotional ROI of that choice or what their different options are. But if somebody wants to do something at some point in the future, the biggest failure case you usually get in design is that they just simply forget.
Right.
So triggering or cueing the behavior around the time they need to actually take action is your big opportunity. So that's why sending out emails and reminders and social media posts the day of is really important. And unfortunately, a lot of those get buried. So and people are
Channel specific.
very channel specific. It's hard in that sense these days, because you get some people are just like, unless it's on Facebook, they're never going to hear about it. Others, unless it's on LinkedIn, they're never going to hear about it, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that piece to it. Then once they want to go and they do remember, hey, it was today, the next thing is like, what am I supposed to do, right? There's a series of actions that are necessary. And so it's not that we're great at all these either. I'm kind of going through this myself,
yeah.
But in order to actually be at the event, it's about knowing where to go, when to go, where to
Parking.
park, how much is going to be parked. Sergio was just pointing out on the way here that we should actually note that if you're here after 6 and park in the garage, you can get validated for a discount on that parking, which is a huge deal, theoretically. I hope that's still true. But if it is, we should certainly be doing that.
You can also point out that on-the-street parking is free on Monday through Wednesday.
Yeah,
Right.
after 6.
After 6,
Or
yeah.
for motorcycles, it's free.
Love it.
Right.
I want to drive a motorcycle. That's on my bucket list.
Oh, yeah.
You start with electric bicycles.
Electric? I don't know, they're not as sexy as a motorcycle.
They can get a fat tire electric.
Happy, healthy, sexy,
Tesla
that's all
motorcycle.
we're about.
One of the things that you may be able to get, you may never be able to get much past the threshold of participation, but you may be able to increase the audience with which you get your participation by having a more diverse vocabulary on your outreach. And this is something you've seen like on Craigslist, Facebook. People just have a rather limited vocabulary, and they don't supplement it with, say, a thesaurus, which you could do. And then using terms, have more connections, potential connections.
By
instead
creating a
of,
broader
So
vocabulary.
language is an entree to different groups, definitely.
right, and not only that, but recognizing people have different lexical sets that they operate with.
Absolutely.
So you want to try to connect to those.
Right, yeah. So if you're going very broad, you're trying to keep it to an 8th grade level of reading,
Not
which is like mass
necessarily.
media does. Well, I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but if you want to sound more academic, then if you want to appeal to this group or that, you need to use the language that they
I'm
speak.
thinking more like
or-
a Venn diagram, and people
Yeah.
have certain words they use, and you just try to put them all together in the center so you intersect with more people.
Right, yeah. Do we want to shift into, well, I guess just to finish that thought about basic principles for whatever it is you're thinking about here. One is make sure that you're cueing people at the time they can actually take action. 2, that you're really clear about what you're asking them to do. And then you look at what friction can I reduce. So a lot of what people talked about here is like, am I going to be, what's the social cost of me walking into a room full of strangers, finding a chair? Am I going to be comfortable in that space?
What are they gonna expect of me?
What are they gonna be
Will I
expecting me?
fit in?
Yeah, so you just march through like all the potential costs somebody might need to pay, and what can you reduce? The cost of finding parking, literally paying for it, but thinking about how to get there, thinking about, so there's mental, physical, social, emotional, financial costs, time costs, how long it's gonna take me, and just meticulously go through and try to trim those down as much as possible. Then the last thing you go to is like motivation. Can I boost up any of these areas of motivation? And certainly priming at the moment someone can actually take action, because they maybe have pumped up a few weeks before, like we said, but are they pumped up the day of, relative to what else is going on? Because now we make decisions based on what is now salient in our mind right now, what's accessible, what's emotionally there. So a lot of other things have popped up from the time they RSVP'd. One more question, and then what I want to break into is if anybody wants to address the crowd.
It's not important, it's just an idea I just had.
No, that's okay. You can.
Well, one of the things I was thinking to increase social interaction, and I think I need to do this for myself, is some sort of motivator.
Mhm.
What you need is some sort of gauge people are interacting.
Mhm.
So what I would suggest is you get poker tokens
Mhm.
of all different colors,
Mhm.
and you come in, sign up, you get 3 of the same color.
Mhm.
And then you interact with people, you exchange it, and when you have 3 of 3 different colors, you can get a beer.
There you go.
Oh.
But how are you gonna get
I
people
need
to interact
everyone to drink
without
that beer,
alcohol?
because I don't wanna lug it home.
Well, then we have to figure out how to cook with it.
Okay, is there anybody here who's looking for a job, who has a job to offer, who is looking for partners on something, who would like to address the crowd for 30 seconds, 60 seconds to ask or advertise or share something? There you go. We got one right here.
My name is Bruce Camping. I'm looking for an opportunity. I've been doing user interaction design in process control and people that operate large chemical plants. And so I've been working on decision making. So I'm looking for an opportunity to help somebody improve the decision making process of their services or their product.
Excellent. Anybody else? Anyone looking for a job? Hands up. Okay. Nikki, you don't want to say anything? No? Okay. Anyone have a job on offer? No? That's unusual. Usually we have some. And anybody looking for partners to work on a project? No? Okay. Quiet.
Everyone's
All right.
tired, we wanna go home.
All right. Okay, thanks for coming out, everyone.
Drink some beer, now I can say that.
Drink some beer, you drive on.
On the way home.
We meet at the same time every month, same place. So just go ahead and put it on your calendar. Every 4th Monday, you're coming out here. There's nothing else more exciting than being here on the 4th Monday every month.
It's a good thing it's not one of the other Mondays, because CFI always has something on first, second, or third.
I just got that from Cadam's course. And I'm wearing them out.
It depends on how diligent I am. We have an on, pretty much chips and chair, just to people suggest recipes. And we have, so that's just our program. We have like our third track is our next editorial channel. And sometimes I have like 3 or once a month. Right now I just have the first. Were you there? Get on it, fill out the rest.
Yeah, we always appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, thanks.
Good to see you again. Been out a few times before. Thank you. Thank you.
You know what, Zach, so he told me he's downstairs on the first floor. There's something going on over there. Zach will help me tap the door.
Yeah.
I can go down. I'm gonna see if we can find him. There's an event downstairs. I don't know if he's still there. Is there like a stand or something?
There is meetup groups.
I know. My company used to go to that's really crazy for me. Membership work for people who are willing to give back.
were speaking today, so I downloaded the last weekend. What groups are going on? Wait, what groups are there? I'm like, oh, that's a cool group. Let's check this out. I'm working on. I've got a so so what do you guys do? Because I didn't read it. No, like, I know nothing about this group. Okay, so.
We start off as a big part of our population
Won't do anything about it.
Austin is
Are you specifically trying to get a
It's funny because now that I think about it, it's all the non-school stuff. So wouldn't it be cool if
Conversation.
Because I know the guy who's head of cultural change at Airport, and he works with highly reliable organizations. He's doing a startup right now, but he also has a biopsychology degree.
Sure.
So he has engineering.
I work with their code all the time.
Exactly. So I don't know if his insights. Right. Well, it's a highly reliable organization. And so you don't want to surface, you don't want to surface mistakes. Yeah, you want to surface even rookie mistakes, which is even another challenge.
Oh, thank you.
He was in charge of that.
He doesn't come with these.
It's really different topics. I'm gonna get this. Yeah, so he'll be in. Because there's a lot of really interesting things that are based on energy usage, and I think we get, solar streams and, renewable energy in the house, and they start using more energy than they did before that. So it's actually a reverse effect. So, yeah, because they've given themselves permission because they've just gotten on the grid.
let's go
That's exactly what he said.
at the next.
Well, I mean, usually developers. So I'm sorry.
That's true.
Developers just want to build a bunch of buildings. Make all the traffic happen.
That's true.
You just want to put weird builds on my property.
It was in my I mean, this was my bad.
Oh yeah, I saw that it was a platform.
Hi, good to see you again. Robin, right?
Robin,
Pavel. Good to meet you. Well, nice to meet you, Pavel. Good to meet you. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'll come on. It's my second one. You guys have one.
I'm gonna need help getting it right now to my.
Yeah.
We have a marketing group, so that's a thing, right? So we
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, tell me more about that.
Well, we have a specific way to save, and we gotta organize it. But right now we're discussing on the issue that and
Yeah.
and we're across right now. We're already across Facebook, LinkedIn. We have obviously.
So I know a friend
Yeah.
who used to work at Airport.
Yeah.
Just like
I'm gonna try to get him as a speaker, but I can make sure he.
how we like.
Yeah, I don't have a card, but I can be there.
You want to ping somebody else?
Yeah. Okay, I'll do that. Yeah. Yeah. Wait, is that a Slack? Like, you ping it like a generic term? Generic way, or? Okay. Oh, okay, that's fine.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because sometimes people mean it. Slack or something.
Oh, yeah, no, that would.
Okay.
Should be.
Alright, I'll do that. Yeah, what's the next one?
Yeah, right, just a little.
Maybe some people, I don't know. Like, I don't know. I think of some.
There's a video explaining side groups specific to gamification. So the company is sure it's reproducible. The project's all right. So quantum computers, if you do that, we down the whole during.
Does anyone need validation for parking? This is the magic ticket. All right, it's leaving. Bubble, see you.
See you later.
That's fine. I've got that and that. All right. So, instead of having to pull down the bulk of the whole apparatus,
Right.
you're familiar with D-wave systems. We're independent of the quantum computing, the quantum annealing system. It's not a general purpose. It's an analytic system. It solves the traveling salesman problems, edge maze. So I'm just trying to get to a lot of stuff quickly. So, but if you could do this down instead of like do lasers on a chip and scale down, you're just cooling down the Joseph injectors on the chip. Then you just eliminated crowd, your cascade iterations.
Right.
Now you have it in your pocket.
Right.
Something
Good.
that's like that.
So the question there is
Why has nobody else seen this yet?
how do you deal with the power issues?
By not having to cool down the whole day room. You just cool down a few molecules of a Joseph injection.
Right.
Now it'll be a 10, 12, and 10.
And what size battery does it take to run that for 2 days? I mean, those are the questions, right?
Yeah,
That-
probably an 18650 or two, but small. Actually, that will work for example. Last year, tried to nootropic, but doing nicotine.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't want to get power and all that.
totally want.